So I'm going to get started here. And the whole motivation for this pair of talks came from having, well, years of teaching in physical sciences and mathematics, and kind of coming to an understanding that when it comes to human use of energy, decision making is a really hard thing for us to do. And that's partially because when it comes to energy, decision making ultimately comes down to understanding the relevant physics. And many human interactions don't come down to that kind of thing. So we're very used to having strong opinions about the way we interact, what the idea of justice is, what the idea of fairness is, etc. And those things can't just be boiled down to simple numbers. But when it comes down to energy, that is often the best way to start looking at things. So you kind of have to start conversations there. They can go lots of different directions afterwards. But if you fail to talk about the numbers when you're talking about energy, you are failing to talk about energy sensibly. And so it's a good thing to kind of keep pushing into the public all the time. And in my role as either a teacher or whatever I'm doing, is something that kind of naturally fits into my world. So it's all about decision making. And I'm going to introduce stuff starting with a really basic concept, but critical importance. And that is we need to talk sensibly about energy itself. And I'm just going to switch cameras to see if this works. All right, you should be able to see a pen on a piece of paper. Give me a thumbs up if that's kind of clear. Okay, great. So from now on, I will be a disembodied head talking to you with pencil and paper. This is my substitute for a whiteboard. It just allows us to be a little bit more clear about some of the topics. The starting point when it comes to energy is how do we measure it? We measure wealth with dollars. We measure length with meters. Energy is a bit slipperier because we can't really identify easily what it is. We can, however, name it and count it. And the unit that we're going to use for this is a metric unit, and it's given this kind of symbol, capital J for joule. How many people have heard of what a joule is before, or heard of a joule? We've got a couple of thumbs up, great. So it's not a new topic, but putting a joule into meaning, by the way, if you're European, you would pronounce this joule. I'm not sure what pronunciation you want to settle on, but that doesn't really matter so much. What really matters is that we have a sense of how much a joule is. Because we have such a small group, I'll open up the floor. Does anyone want to give me an example of what a joule is, a single joule, some sort of energetic example? We'll let the clock run for 5 seconds.
I only remember what a horsepower is.
Right. Okay. Horsepower is a measure of of power. This is actually a measure of energy, and energy is the slippery of the two. I'm not even going to talk really about what 1 joule is, because 1 joule is very hard to kind of put used to in real life. If you want an example, this is like a 1 liter water bottle. If I lift a 1 liter water bottle up 10 centimeters, that's about 1 joule worth of energy. And so it's a very small quantity of energy and not super useful when it comes time to do real life things like have a shower, drive a car, fly to Mexico, whatever it is you're doing. And so the notion of 1 joule is not super useful for what we're talking about today. And instead, what we're going to do is talk about a much bigger measure of energy, which looks like this. So that's just 3.6 million joules. That's all that is. And it might seem like a goofy number to choose. Why would you choose 3.6 million joules? You'll see why in a few minutes. So if you can just suspend your disbelief for a few minutes, and we're going to deal with this number. So instead of dealing with 1 joule, we're going to deal with this thing called 3.6 million joules, or 3.6 capital M megajoules. That's going to be the currency for the whole evening when we talk about energy. And the useful thing is that when we talk about it in those terms, that's also the same terms that everybody else on the planet, at least in the metric converted countries, uses for energy measurement. So if we talk about it here, it's going to be sensible everywhere else. So 3.6 million joules, that's going to be our measure. And to give you an idea of what that means, I'm going to hit you with a bunch of examples. So here's the way this is going to work. You're going to see a bunch of examples of energy use in front of you. And what I want you to do is try and think about which ones are more energy and which ones are less energy. And then that'll give us some scaling later on as to what 3.6 million joules are. So here's a sheet of different examples we're going to look at. I'll go through these in detail. So in the first instance, my upper right, 3 Cliff Bars worth of energy. So you take 3 Cliff Bars, you eat them, now you have a bunch of energy and you can do stuff with them. That's one of the quantities we care about. In the second case, pretty much all of you are probably familiar with the Squamish Chief. We're going to hike 7 people up the Squamish Chief. How many people here have been up the Squamish Chief before? We got at least a couple thumbs up. All right. So this is going to be 7 people going up the Chief, 3 Cliff Bars worth of energy. In this instance here, we're going to take 5 kettles and boil 5 liters of water. So from room temperature to boiling, 5 kettles worth of water. That's pretty clear. In the case down below, we're going to take a regular automobile, the likes of which we all know, and we're going to drive it down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour. So 100 kilometers per hour for 20 seconds. 100 kilometers an hour for 20 seconds. That's what we're going to do in this case here. In the case up here on the right-hand side middle, that's supposed to be a bullet from a high-powered rifle. We're going to take 4,000 of these, 4,000 flying bullets from a high-powered rifle. And in the final example here down below, this is supposed to be a server farm, the likes of which Google would have or Netflix would have. And we're going to tap into a server farm and stream a video for maybe 2 hours. Clearly, all of these things are tied to energy. You can't get to the top of the Chief without sweating. You can't boil water without paying for it in your electricity bill. You can't drive a car down the highway, etc. These things are all tied to your energetic examples. Anyone want to take a guess as to which of these requires the most energy or the least?
Can I ask one clarifying question? Are you including in the energy the manufacturing of each of the items?
So in this case, no. We're looking at the most superficial analysis possible. So just taking the people to the top of the Chief. We're not going to grow the babies and turn them into humans that can walk. And same with the Cliff Bars. We're just going to take the ingredients and stuff them down your mouth and have them metabolize in your stomach. Same with the bullets. We're not going to make the bullets. We're just going to have them flying through the air. For the server farm, all we're going to do is power up the server farm and run the fans and the processes. So this is the most superficial understanding of the energy here.
I'm going to guess the server farm takes the most energy.
Okay. We have one person betting on the server farm. Thank you, John. Any other people want to take guesses at the most or least? Okay, well, here's the
least boiling the water is the least.
The least boiling the water. Okay, right on. The surprising result is that all of these examples are tied to pretty much the same amount of energy, give or take 10%. And it's not obvious, but that same amount of energy for all of these things is our magical 3.6 million joules. So if you have 4,000 bullets from a high-powered rifle flying through the air, that's approximately 3.6 million joules. If you eat 3 Cliff Bars and then go and do something, metabolize them, approximately 3.6 million joules. Similarly to boiling 5 liters of water in a kettle, approximately 3.6 million joules. And a server farm serving your computer Netflix for 1 to 2 hours, by the way, there's huge variability in this number, roughly 3.6 megajoules. Wow. So these things are all examples. Oh, by the way, yeah, 7 people to the top of the Chief. That's just hiking them up, not hiking them down. Is again about 3.6 megajoules of metabolized energy to get humans up there. Same thing for a car driving down the highway. So clearly, these are all things that are really relevant in our daily life. Well, maybe not the high-powered bullet thing, but we all eat food. We all walk around outside. We certainly boil water, drive cars. Most of us have the internet. You're doing so right now. In fact, you could argue that the cost of you being in this meeting tonight, which is about an hour of streaming time, is approximately 3.6 megajoules of energy. By the way, if you turn your camera off and stop streaming, you can save about 90% of that energy. It's the video that costs the most. But I would still encourage you to keep the video on. We can talk about why later on. Just think of all the energy you save by not getting in your car and driving to a public venue in North Van tonight, which is probably what we would have been doing this time last year had we decided to carry this meeting out. Any questions about this 3.6 megajoules of energy and approximately what it means in our real lives?
I have a quick question as to, I presume that the car you're using is an ICE. Does it matter much if we're using a Tesla?
Oh, no, actually doesn't matter much at all. This is the cost of pushing a piece of steel down the road at 100 kilometers an hour against air drag. Doesn't really matter what kind of car it is. It's going to be about the same amount of energy. There is a detail hiding in this that I will discuss later to do with the efficiencies of fossil fuels. But for now, roughly speaking, no, it doesn't really matter what kind of car is going down the road. All right, so we have this metric that we can use to understand energy now. Joules were kind of useless, but these 3.6 million joules are quite useful. And they're so useful that I'm going to give them a different name. And a different name we're going to give them comes from this slide here. It's going to be little k, capital W, HR, and we're going to pronounce this a kilowatt hour. Kilowatt hour is the measure of energy that we're going to use for the rest of these talks. This is the same billing unit that's used by BC Gas when they charge you for your house for gas use, for electricity use. This is the standard measurement, although there are different measurements from gas companies, but they can all be transferred to kilowatt hours very easily. Okay, so we have an idea of what 1 kilowatt hour is, and on this graphic, 1 kilowatt hour is represented by one little red square. So one of these little red squares is enough energy to take 7 kids up the Chief, or to have 4,000 high-powered bullets flying past your head. Maybe not flying past you. They're boiling 5 kettles worth of water. That's going to be one of these little squares. So on this graphic here, we have a range of numbers. So there's one bundle, there's another bundle, 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 bundle. These things are 30 blocks right here, 50 blocks, 100, 200, and 400. So 30 kilowatt hours all the way up to 400 kilowatt hours here. What I want you to do now is see if you can take a guess on what your daily energy needs are as a Canadian citizen living with the standard of life that you know and love. So anything from 30 kilowatt hours a day up to 400 kilowatt hours. Where do you think you are in this range? Now, when I say you, what I mean is the average Canadian, because you may live a very abnormal life. So give that some thought for a minute. Anything from 30 kilowatt hours up to 400. Connie, you had a hand up for a second. Oh, you're guessing 400? Okay. Actually, that one is going to be of specific interest to you later on, Connie. You'll see in a minute. So Connie's taking her $10 bill and she's putting it on this column right here for 400 kilowatt hours. Anyone else want to take a wild guess? Richard, you've unmuted yourself. Go ahead, take a stab. What do you think?
100.
100. All right. So we have Richard here. We have Connie here. Anyone else want to take? All right, well, nicely done. You guys have spanned the correct answer. The correct answer is that as a Canadian living with our standard of life, we use 200 kilowatt hours a day of energy. Now, to get to Kim's point earlier, what do we mean when we say that? This is everything, all in. This is not just you running your refrigerator and your laptop and your cell phone and driving yourself to work. This is also powering the hospital that you go to, the school that your kids go to. It's building the roads to and from the farmland that grows your food. It's everything, just divided by the number of people we have in Canada. So in order for us to sustain our entire lifestyle, in order to have government buildings and to have water filtration systems and to have bureaucracies and all the things that come with our lives, we need per person 200 kilowatt hours per day. It's worth stopping and reflecting on that for a second, because a minute ago you had a chance to understand what 1 kilowatt hour is. That's like 5 kettles boiling water. It's like 7 kids walking to the top of the Chief. Now multiply that by 200, and that's what you require for your quality of life. If you want to know where these other numbers come from, Connie, this one here is Iceland. If you live in Iceland, you require almost double the amount of your average Canadian. 100 kilowatt hours, this is Japan. Oh, I think I have another graphic for this, but maybe I do. Yeah, here we go. So here are the countries that these things relate to. I'm hoping the text is reading forward for you guys, right? It's not backwards, is it?
No, it's okay. It's straight
Okay, so here we have Iceland here at 400 kilowatt hours per day, Canada at 200, Japan at 100, Hong Kong at 50, Peru at 30. This is a huge disparity in how much energy each of us needs. Clearly, every one of these is humans all over the world. There's no difference between the humans. There are three major differences between these groups of people. And these aren't in any particular order, but the first one is population density. When you have very high population density, like they have in Hong Kong, you get economies of scale when it comes to energy. And so Hong Kong, people living in Hong Kong can use approximately a quarter of the energy that we do. Hong Kong is definitely, well, we'll talk about that in a second. So population density definitely plays in. Japan and Canada, again, incomparable population density. Over 100 people per square kilometer in Japan, approximately 4 people per square kilometer in Canada. Iceland also has a population density difference. They just simply do not realize economies of scale. So population density matters greatly. There are two other major differences between the groups here. Does anyone want to take a stab at what they might be?
Climate?
I'm gonna generalize what you said. Not so much climate, but latitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The closer you are to the equator, the less energy you need, simply. If you live in a net heating climate like we do in Canada and Iceland, heating costs you a lot. It's harder to grow food, it's harder to keep warm. That's a huge amount of our energy goes to that kind of thing. So latitude matters a lot. But Canada and Japan have very similar latitudes. So the main difference between these two is population density. Like Japan simply realizes economies of scale that we don't when it comes to energy distribution and use. What's the last one?
Standard of living.
Yeah, exactly. Standard of living. We live as high on the hog as is almost possible for humans in any time in history and any place in geography. So that costs us a lot. And you can see it on our energy numbers. This number, 200 kilowatt hours a day, is super important. And it is generally agreed upon by 3 or 4 major sources, everything from the World Bank to the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, and a couple of other major private international data crunching analysis people pretty much agree on this number, plus or minus 5%. So there's not a lot of disagreement on that kind of number. By the way, these numbers are done for every country in the world, obviously, and they're great from a policy setting standpoint. So in Canada, if we want to decarbonize, which is something that we all pretty much agree we have to do, we need to find 200 kilowatt hours per day per person to do that, if we want to maintain our standard of living. We can't change our latitude. We could change our population density, and there may be some strong bearing on our energy efficiency if we do that. But in terms of our current population density, current latitude, we pretty much need to find this number, 200 kilowatt hours per day per person. And that's a lot. It's a lot of energy, as you can see, from the kettle boiling or from the cars driving down the highway. So another obvious question coming out of this is, where the heck do we get this energy from right now? So in this graphic here, I'm just giving you the 4 major choices for us of where we currently get energy. Now I'm talking Canada, so this is federal here, nationwide. The 4 choices they're going to give you are hydropower, dams, stored water, biofuels. This is things like cogen plants burning wood to produce steam spin turbines. This image here is to represent all renewable. So we're talking solar, wind, geothermal, tidal. Those would be the main categories. And this image here is meant to indicate fossil fuels. So we're talking natural gas, coal, and any other petrochem-fired turbine system, essentially. So our options are hydropower, biofuels, renewables, and when I say renewables, I mean pure renewables, as opposed to biofuels. I'm just taking that category out for now. There's no good reason to do that except for it's worked out nicely with numbers, and fossil fuels. So in your mind, see if you can rank these in terms of importance from the overall Canadian energy profile. Where do we get the most energy from? Where do we get the least?
Well,
I'll take bids right now for the most. Does anyone want to take a guess at where the most energy comes from?
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, but it's not so much in British Columbia, though.
True, that is true. British Columbia, we have this wonderful ability to act righteous as we exploit hydropower to a great extent. That's absolutely true. Roughly speaking, in Canada, 66% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. It bears the lion's share of our energy production. Mostly, we're talking here natural gas plants, and then some liquid fuels and some coal, but not a lot. It's kind of spread across all three fairly evenly. What about least? Where do we get the least energy from?
Renewables.
Yeah, true.
Biofuels.
Yeah, 1% roughly for renewables. And that's pretty flat across the provinces. There's a bit of variation, but federally, we're looking at 1% nationally. That leaves us with these other two, and they're not far off of each other. Hydropower nationally is about 18%, biofuels roughly 15%. And that's our energy portfolio. If you add that up, it's darn close to 100%. That's pretty much the Canadian story. This, by the way, is very different depending on what country you're looking at. So you can identify countries by their energy profile. They differ radically. But these talks are intended to be Canada focused because it's the Green Party of Canada. So I think we'll stick to a Canadian profile and just kind of use that for our understanding. But just realize that 2/3 of our energy does currently come from the petrochem industry. And that is going to be important later on when we talk about another detail. All right, so that's where the energy comes from. The next question is, what the heck do we do with it all? It's easy for me to sit here and list off, we all have daily energy use that we know about, things like taking showers, making tea, drying clothes, driving to Green Party of Canada meetings. Those are all examples of things that we're pretty familiar with. But in terms of big, broad categories of where we as Canadian humans use energy, I'm breaking it down to 5. And this is kind of arbitrary, but again, the numbers kind of work out to make things nice. So here are 5 categories to think about. The first one is defense. Clearly, this is not anything to do with the Canadian Army. I just chose this because I like the marching position. So anything to do with military or defense is category number 1. Transport. This includes people transport. It includes goods transport. It includes anything internal and half of everything international. So if a truck goes down to Florida and back, we would be counting half of that journey as a Canadian transport cost. If you fly to Mexico and back, half of that energy would be considered a Canadian transport cost. So the second category is transportation of all things, food, people. Thirdly, we have general heating and cooling. This is all heating and cooling for homes, businesses, hospitals, government buildings, common areas, public areas. Heating and cooling is an entirely separate category. The fourth category here is manufacturing. And this is all kind of manufacturing. Anything like electronics, clothes, roads, building materials, building buildings themselves, building houses. Yeah, that's pretty much this is kind of like the stuff category, us making stuff. And finally, we have agriculture. This is the production of food, including fertilizer and the act of farming itself, or any kind of food production, whether that be raising livestock or actually harvesting produce. This does not include the transport of goods, of agricultural goods. That's buried under this transport here. Any questions about clarification for these 5 categories? These are the 5 big categories for where we use energy. So military, defense, transport, heating and cooling, manufacturing, and agriculture. It gets harder here to know where the biggest slice of the pie is. Anyone want to take a stab?
I think it's transport.
Okay, we have a bet for transport.
I vote transport.
Okay.
I would guess heating and cooling.
Okay, yeah, tempting. I'll give you the numbers right now. Transport, 44%. 44% for transport, and roughly heating and cooling is roughly 20% nationally. So we spend about twice as much energy transporting stuff around as we do heating and cooling. And there's a really good reason for that. It has to do with the efficiencies of what's going on here, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. All right. That still doesn't necessarily answer what the, well, I guess we're over 60%, so we can't really beat that. So yes, John, you're right. Transport is the biggest energy sink that we have. How about ordering these last three? It's a little bit tricky, maybe. Anyone want to go for the smallest?
Military.
Absolutely. I put that on there as a bit of a red herring. The military is roughly 2% of our energy cost. It essentially doesn't exist.
Yay,
But it
Canada.
is on there. What's that? Go ahead.
I was just saying, yay, Canada, that's all we spend on it.
Right, yeah. This is actually pretty typical. Militaries don't use up a lot of energy. It's just a bit of a red herring. People tend to think they do. Manufacturing and agriculture are the balance of everything. Turns out that food is roughly 8%. See if I can write that there. 8%. That is the growing of food, not the transportation of food. The transportation of food is energetically costly, but the creation of food is not so bad. And that leaves with the balance of manufacturing, which in Canada is roughly 26%. All right, so transport is our big one. Manufacturing second biggest, and then heating and cooling. So those are our big sinks right there. These two guys are quite small. But it gives you an idea of what we use our energy for. It's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the energy we use is the energy we use personally, the energy we use to charge our cell phone, to cook dinner, to have a shower. And that's true. Those things all show up in here. But most of us live largely divorced from at least 4 of these things. If you're in the manufacturing sector, you'll be tied to that one quite tightly, but chances are you don't know much about agriculture or general transport. And so most of us are largely unaware of where the big energy sinks are. And that's critical because when it comes to understanding where this 200 kilowatt hours comes from and goes to, the real thing we have to keep in mind is that most of us are blind to most of the energy sinks. And so it's easy to get trapped into thinking that the stuff that's right in front of you is what counts. In other words, unplugging your cell phone charger at night. When really, the big sinks are things that we don't know about or things that our lives are not touched by directly. Of course, they are touched by it indirectly. We all benefit from transport, heating and cooling, and agriculture and manufacturing, but most of us are not tied to those intimately and understand what the daily goings on are. So it's very easy for us to make bad decisions about energy because we simply underestimate what our individual energy requirements are as individuals in Canada. All right, so that gives us an idea of how much energy we need, where it comes from, and where it goes to. I thought we're almost near our time for wrapping up here, so I don't want to go too much overtime here. I definitely want to leave time for discussion and questions because I think that's when we have such a small group, it'd be crazy to not exploit that. But I do want to make one very hopeful case at the end of this to kind of leave you in a good state. Not that those numbers are, super disturbing or anything. Maybe the fact that we're using 200 kilowatt hours per day is a little bit disturbing. But here's a hopeful point. Right now, when we calculate the 200 kilowatt hours of energy required, as you saw in the earlier slide, a lot of that comes from things like transport and agriculture. Realize even though I am a teacher, I do not write for a living, so I just kind of scribble and make sure that I say things clearly. So you don't need to read these. These are more notes for myself. Transport and agriculture are big for us. Same with heating and cooling. So I'll put heat and cold here. For those of you who taught me in my past life, Connie and Dudley, please do not think that my handwriting bears at all upon your teaching ability. These things all heavily depend on fossil fuels. And I'll just put here a capital C for carbon. And when we calculate how much energy we actually need, this 200 kilowatt hours, we are calculating that based upon the fact that many of our major needs are met currently with fossil fuels. And there's a major problem with fossil fuels, which is that if you want to take a liter of gasoline and do something useful with it, you've got to burn it, turn it into a gas, have the gas expand against some sort of movable object, and then somehow extract mechanical energy out of that. When you do that, it's hideously inefficient. For instance, internal combustion engines, the likes of which drive tractor trailers down the road, the likes of which drive your car down the road, unless you own Tesla, are roughly 20% efficient. They peak out at about 25%. Gas turbines, the kind that provide us with baseline power in our overall electrical grid, peak out at about 40% efficiency in Canada. In the world, there are some gas turbines that are about 60% efficient, but most of those are research turbines and they're not really online. So internal combustion engines and turbines are required for many of our major sinks. If we're going to make fertilizers, we use gas-powered turbine plants to undergo the Haber process and make fertilizers, nitrogen-containing fertilizers. They're an extremely high energy molecule to make. And we do so very inefficiently because we're tied to fossil fuels. So one of the easiest ways for us to get away from our huge energy footprint is to get away from fossil fuels, not just because of the carbon problem, but because of the inefficiency problem. And if we were to electrify everything, then suddenly we can stop using internal combustion engines and gas turbines. Now, I'm leaving the question open now about where this electrical energy comes from. There's certainly many options for that, and we'll talk about this in the next talk for sure, about where this electricity is going to come from. But the point is that if we electrify everything instead of using fossil fuels, not only do we stop dumping carbon into the atmosphere, but we realize large efficiency gains because electric motors are far more efficient than internal combustion engines or turbines. And roughly, we can take our 200 kilowatt hours and chop it in half. Roughly speaking, we can expect that our real energetic footprint is something like 100 kilowatt hours if we electrify. And that's a great conclusion because this doesn't require a lot of change in our lifestyle. This is us doing life pretty much the same way we do now, except without the fossil fuels. So I cannot underestimate or understate the importance of switching to more efficiency energy sources, even though they happen to also be low carbon energy sources. And this is the point I wanted to leave you with tonight, is that we can basically chop our energy footprint in half by electrifying. Now, we still leave an open question on where we're going to get this 100 kilowatt hours per person, because we still have to pour concrete sidewalks and run elevators and have ships carrying X, Y, and Z from us to Japan. We can't forget those things. We also need to run hospitals and schools, but we have a major gain to make. And this is all the physics here are done. There's no new technology required in terms of using energy. The creating energy, we'll leave that as an open question now, for now anyway. All right, it's now 7:45, which is our promised cutoff time. I want to leave time for comments, questions, etc. And if I don't hear from you immediately, I also want to ask you questions about where you want to take the next talk. What I would like to do with the next talk, I'll run it by you, is I'd like to make it focus on solar energy and use solar energy as a great example of doing the numbers, because solar energy numbers are very easy to obtain, and it's very easy to talk about solar energy clearly. So what I'd like to do with the next talk is use it as a skeleton example for developing a numerical sense of a particular type of renewable energy. How about questions and comments from this talk right now? I'll open up the floor to anyone who has queries or comments.
I've got one that I've been thinking about, because a lot of people recognize there is a problem, but they don't see it as a problem because we've always been able to be smart enough to find a way out of it. So they put their trust in technology. So we don't really need to worry because, well, for example, all the problems of pollution in the atmosphere, we're just going to build great big vacuum cleaners and suck all of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and problem solved. And I think it's that's got to do with what you were talking about in your introduction, the written one I wrote anyway. It's a problem of scale, and where are you going to generate the energy to fire up the vacuum cleaners? Are going to be, they're also going to be polluting. So I think that's a sort of a misunderstanding based on scale and putting too much trust in technology.
There's one issue with trust in technology for sure. There's another issue with trust in the capitalist system or the market-based system to provide these energetic solutions. The capitalist system will produce anything that there's a market for. It doesn't matter whether that thing is necessarily going to solve problems. It's just a matter if there's a market or not. And we all know that in a lot of these markets, if you create any widget, it will produce its own market. The build it and they will come is a mantra that is definitely proven out to be true. But yeah, it's not hard to even get smart, wealthy investors like Bill Gates to dump millions of dollars into carbon capture technology, even though from a thermodynamic standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't matter whether it makes sense necessarily, it matters whether there's a market for it. And so for the carbon cleaning technology you're talking about, one of the things that creates a market for that is things like federal subsidies for that kind of research and federal subsidies for bringing those kinds of products to production. And this is why I started to talk with the comment about decision making. It's politically expedient to create jobs, to have new technology roll out, to activate investment, and yet those decisions have to be informed by the numbers. And it's my belief that if the federal government had a panel of experts sitting behind those decisions, sponsoring carbon capture wouldn't happen. I just don't think it would. But it is something that gets talked about regularly. Even the IPCC in their 1,600-page report that is a collaboration of 1,600 experts, not that they did a page each, but it's a coincidence. They mentioned that carbon capture technology has never been tested at scale and that there are thermodynamic problems with it. And so, but that doesn't mean there's no market for it. My belief is that we have to stop the market. And to me, the best way to do that is to supplant the market vacuum with better technology. And we'll leave it open right now as to what that better technology is. But that's my belief, is that we have to stop filling the market with any solution that comes along.
I think that one of the things that that seems clear to me is that what we need to have, and I suppose that there will never be complete agreement, but we need to have a scale of efficiency for any source of energy that we're going to use in order to basically buy into the most efficient technologies, taking into consideration all aspects of that technology. And then of course there's the question of, okay, any technology in its early stages is going to be less efficient than it will wind up being as people work on it and develop it further. So the potential efficiencies need to be included along with the current efficiencies. But I think clearly that our decisions need to be based on some kind of scale that evaluates all potential production of energy on a uniform scale, whether it's using kilowatt hours or whatever, but the same scale and all inputs and all outputs.
Yeah, I'll adopt your optimism that kind of thinking is possible. If you get the physics wrong, nothing downstream makes any sense. So that's kind of the main thesis I'm trying to put here, is that yes, there are many different aspects. You could look at risk, you could look at cost, you could look at life cycle analysis, you could look at marketability, you could look at where the maturity level of the technology is. But if you fail to do the right physics, then all of the other factors don't really matter. And the carbon capture is a great example of where the physics haven't been done or have been sidestepped for the sake of meeting other needs, i.e. market needs. So yeah, you're right. These are complicated decisions to make as soon as you start adding in elements that don't come down to the relevant engineering and physics facets, like perception of safety, for instance.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very tricky to make these decisions. But if you don't drive it with the numbers, you're not going down the right road at all.
And I find that it's going to be very jurisdiction specific as to what type of renewable energy is going to be practical in each jurisdiction. It's sort of like on the eastern and western part of Canada, we have more ability for hydro, whereas in the middle of the country, they don't, because we happen to have lots of water. So similarly in Germany, they specifically look at different jurisdictions and whether wind might be better than solar or vice versa, or a combination of the two. It always blows my mind that here in British Columbia that we don't have offshore wind. It is everywhere in the world, but we don't have it here. And it's not like we don't have offshore, and it's not like we don't have wind. So that would be, you know, one of the things that I think that we should look at here in British Columbia, because I understand it's also one of the cheapest forms of electricity to produce.
Yeah, and you're in Squamish Court. Squamish has wind, yeah, world famous wind.
It's true. The jurisdictional aspect is really interesting, and especially when you think about Germany as an example. Germany is in the throes right now of phasing out all of their nuclear reactors, all of them, and that's been happening for the last 10 years and probably will continue for at least the next couple of years. And that it has nothing to do with, you know, the geography. It has everything to do with the political expedience of doing that. And you know, that might be okay in one country and absolutely not okay in the next country. You know, Germany borders France. France is also, you know, shutting down nuclear power plants, but right now it gets roughly 80% of its energy is nuclear power. So yeah, there are geographical elements to decisions that get made, but there are political elements as well. And what I would like to see is the depoliticization of discussions of energy, so that we can step aside from the political aspect, which I think are really, really dangerous and very easy to lead us down the wrong path, and then make decisions based on geography. That makes a lot more sense.
Yes, and we also have to make sure that the fossil fuel companies, they tend to hire former cabinet ministers. And as an example, Mo Sahota is a lobbyist for wood fiber, and yet he's also a spokesperson for the NDP. So somehow or another, I think we need to change the legislation so that that becomes a conflict of interest of some sort. I mean, to me, it's an obvious conflict of interest, but apparently it isn't. So we need to do something about that as well.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the tiny answer I have to that is that education of the population is the only lever that I think we can pull in any kind of long-term way. Because the better educated we are, the less we'll tolerate that kind of thing. But it's too slow. It's not fast enough to deal with the decarbonization.